As a fan, there's almost nothing more exciting than seeing a UFC fight end in a spectacular knockout. The thrill you feel in that moment, the roar you hear from the crowd, and the funny expressions of Daniel Cormier and Joe Rogan all make that moment feel special. But what makes a knockout even more special is when it's done ruthlessly, with the intention of ending the fight and completely obliterating the opponent. So in today's video, we're going over some of the most lethal UFC knockouts of all time. Of course, you don't want to miss this one, so sit back, relax, and let's begin. Valentina Shevchenko versus Jessica Eye. At the co-main event of UFC 238, Valentina "Bullet" Shevchenko showed us, UFC fans, why she's a perfect blend of beauty and brutality. In her first defense of the UFC Women's Flyweight Championship, Shevchenko caught Jessica Eye with a soul-snatching head kick that sent Jessica straight to the canvas. It sounded like someone smashing a bag with a baseball bat, but who knows, maybe it even felt the same. But it was clean, perfectly timed, and unforgettable. Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva. The winning streak of Anderson Silva was cut short by Chris Weidman, an underdog before the fight. At UFC 162, Anderson Silva initially played his regular showboating card against Weidman, and we don't blame him though. When you've been the champ for over 6 years, you begin to feel indestructible. However, Weidman proved that theory wrong. With Anderson disrespecting Weidman during the fight, Weidman's sixth sense kicked in to deliver a series of punches, with one actually knocking Silva down. And that's how the king of the middleweight division, Anderson the Spider Silva, was dethroned with a picture-perfect knockout. Ronda Rousey versus Alexis Davis. In the prime of Ronda Rousey's reign as the UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion, she had one of the biggest highlights of her career in her fight against Alexis Davis at UFC 175. In 3 very straightforward steps, Ronda ended the fight in the first 16 seconds of the first round. 1. She delivered a good right hand to Alexis's face, 2. a knee to her body, and 3. a brutal toss to the ground where Ronda punched Alexis's consciousness away from her body with her mighty fists. Alexis had no idea what happened after the fight. Her lights went off completely. But there's nothing more annoying than having a taste of your own medicine. It's a bitter experience, and this wasn't any different for Ronda Rousey. After successfully defending the UFC Women's Bantamweight title 6 times and losing it to Holly Holmes in 2015, she set a record of her own by losing in the most horrible way possible to Amanda the Lioness Nunes. After almost a year away from the UFC, Ronda returned to challenge Amanda Nunes for the UFC Women's Bantamweight title. But Amanda showed the world she wasn't called the Lioness for nothing. Nunes' ruthless attacks made Ronda bounce around the octagon like metal balls in a pinball machine, giving Ronda those shaky noodle legs and blurry vision. Seeing that Ronda was barely keeping herself on her feet, referee Herb Dean stepped in to call off the fight, awarding Amanda Nunes the win via TKO in just 48 seconds of the first round. Francis Ngannou versus Alistair Overeem. At UFC 218, Francis Ngannou came out with all guns blazing against MMA veteran Alistair Overeem. Somewhere in the middle of the first round, Ngannou caught Alistair with a superb left uppercut that connected perfectly with Alistair's chin. Like geez, it was so brutal. Alistair looked like he was having a seizure or something from the way his toes curled up. And if you pause the exact moment Ngannou's fist connected to Alistair's chin, you'd see that it was a perfect uppercut, man. It doesn't get any better than that. Great job on that one, Ngannou. Vitor Belfort versus Wanderlei Silva. In one of those UFC classic fights, Vitor Belfort put up a show against Wanderlei Silva back in October 1998. Vitor pulled off a Mortal Kombat type of attack by raining a barrage of punches on Wanderlei Silva till he got knocked out. You can't convince us that this guy didn't play a video game before the fight, because it was something extraordinary. BJ Penn versus Caol Uno. We're tempted to not repeat the same Mortal Kombat joke, but this next knockout also fits the description. In BJ Penn's first fight against Caol Uno, Uno attempted a wild, and we mean very wild, flying kick on BJ Penn. But Penn retaliated by hitting 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 10 blistering jabs on Uno to finish Uno on the ground. What's even more interesting is the fact that it ended in just 11 seconds into the first round. Another man who set a record with the timing and precision of his knockout is Conor McGregor in his fight against Jose Aldo for the UFC featherweight title back in 2015. In one of the most anticipated bouts of the UFC's featherweight division, Conor McGregor slept Jose Aldo in the first round with his notorious left-hand jab. Once the fight started, Aldo moved toward Conor, and boom, Conor struck, and Aldo was out cold. That was also the moment we realized Conor was as good as advertised. What a way to win a title. Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal. The Nigerian nightmare Kamaru Usman was and still is one of the best UFC welterweight fighters of all time. He proved that theory right in his rematch against Jorge Masvidal at UFC 261. He took Jorge Street Jesus Masvidal to a street fight, sending a straight right hand as sharp as a spear to Masvidal's chin and pounding the heck out of his face on the ground with hammer fists. If you've never been a fan of Kamaru Usman, that fight is one reason you might want to be. The guy is freaking good and undefeatable. Well, that was what we thought until UFC 278, when Leon Edwards proved us wrong. In the main event of the card, and with less than 1 minute left in the final round, Leon Edwards won the most improbable finish ever. Edwards delivered a perfectly disguised head kick that caught Usman right on the spot and knocked him out. That, my friends, is one knockout you don't get to see every day. Edson Barbosa versus Terry Atim. Brazilian UFC lightweight fighter Edson Barbosa made history at UFC 142 against Terry Atim. In the third round of their fight, Edson delivered the most precise, vicious, and spectacular wheel kick we've seen in the UFC. The brutality of the kick sent Terry straight to the canvas. There was no surviving that. No way. With his knockout, Edson became the first fighter in UFC history to finish their opponent with a spinning wheel kick. Anthony Pettis versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. In his return to the welterweight division on UFC on ESPN Plus 6, Anthony Pettis tore a page out of WWE superstar Roman Reigns' book to knock out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson with a Superman punch. Who even knew that was possible in MMA? Well, it's definitely one for the record books. Jake Collier versus Alberto Uda. At UFC Fight Night 88 back in 2016, Jake Collier claimed a spot on the most devastating knockouts in UFC history by completely destroying the body of Albert Uda with ruthless kicks till Uda's consciousness was nowhere to be found. The finish was so good, it earned Jake the Performance of the Night bonus. Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez. The notorious one, Conor McGregor, came along with his notorious guns to outtake, outpower, and ultimately knock out one of the greatest fighters in MMA history. Eddie Alvarez at UFC 205 for the lightweight championship. For a championship fight, Eddie didn't look like he was in his best form, or maybe Conor was just too hot for him to handle, who knows. Anderson Silva versus Vitor Belfort. During the reign of Anderson Silva at the UFC middleweight champion, he faced a formidable opponent, Vitor Belfort, at UFC 126 back in 2011. This was the Battle of the Greats, the Clash of the Titans, but Anderson once again proved to us why he was on an entirely different level from the rest. First, he delivered a straight front leg kick to Vitor's jaw, sending him down to the ground. Belfort tried to fight back, but we bet in that moment his head was spinning so bad he probably saw like 4 or 5 different Anderson Silvas in front of him. Anyway, with 2 hammer fists to Vitor on the ground, the referee called off the fight and Anderson Silva successfully bagged another title defense. And now for the moment we've been waiting for, the #1 most devastating knockout in UFC's history. Jorge Masvidal's flying knee against Ben Askren at UFC 239. This knockout isn't just the most devastating, it holds the record for the fastest knockout in UFC history at 5 seconds. You literally could have just checked a notification on your phone or even looked away for 5 seconds and ended up missing the entire fight. Immediately the fight began, Masvidal ran to Askren with a flying knee that knocked him out cold. This knockout was so good, Masvidal even got a tattoo of it. How cool is that?